As we all know, climate change is bringing us hotter and drier conditions, and with that comes more days of severe fire weather. Now, the 2019-20 fires were enormous, and the most unprecedented thing about them was the subsequent focus on wildlife impacts, and that led to an equally unprecedented amount of research funding. Now, this funding gave us the opportunity to look at the consequences of the fire for ground-dwelling vertebrates, but also to explore whether other major threatening processes could interact with fire. Now, feral herbivores are a well-known threat to some of the small vertebrates in the Australian Alps. Horses, for example, eat up the grass and mush up the ground that would otherwise be habitat for native species. I'm going to talk about 4 species today, and to help us remember which is which, I've got some actions that go along with each, and you can do this at home because nobody can see you doing it. So the first species is the broad-toothed rat. It has cute little ears. It's listed as vulnerable in New South Wales and Victoria. Eulamprus kosciuszkoi is the alpine water skink, not to be confused with the alpine beer skink. The alpine water skink is typically associated with sphagnum moss bogs. Eulamprus tympanum is the third species. This is the southern water skink. It's a widespread species, it's not threatened. It uses riparian habitat in a range of forest types. The fourth species is Pseudomoya cryodroma. This is the alpine bog skink. It's listed as endangered, and it lives in and around drainage lines in the alpine areas. Now, past research has shown that these species or related species can decline after fire, and there's also some research showing that some of these species are impacted by feral horses. So there's reasonable grounds to expect that these species could be affected by the 2019-20 fires. They could be affected by herbivores, or they could be affected by the interactions between those two things. Zach Walker led teams that surveyed 162 sites. 82 of these sites were in alpine areas and 37 of those were burnt, and 80 were in the lowland eucalypt forests and 50 of those were burnt. The 2 alpine skinks and the broad-toothed rats are all found in the alpine areas, so our analysis just uses that subset of sites for those species. The southern water skink occurs across the whole set of sites. Now, this offers the opportunity to both explore the effects of the spatial extent of fires as well as severity on the species, or at least that's what we thought. Now that we've got the data, it turns out that severity is highly correlated with extent. The correlation coefficient is 0.83, so that makes it impossible to distinguish the effects of severity from extent. Now, the skinks and the broad-toothed rat was surveyed in transects that were about 100 metres by 10 metres. They were time constrained, and we took photos to help identify the skinks, and the broad-toothed rats were identified by their distinctive scats, very distinctive shape, green coloured, and found along runways and pop holes. We repeated the surveys 3 times, and we collected the survey covariates, temperature, cloud, wind, rain, date, and survey effort. And these were used in our modelling. The explanatory covariates we used were collected from data at 50 points along the 100-metre transect, and that included vegetation structure, moss cover, weed cover, logs, horse, deer and pig damage, although there was very little pig damage, severity on a scale of 0 to 5, with 0 being unburnt and 5 being obliterated, and we used historic fire layers to get the number of fires between 1939 and 2019. Now, our analysis, we modelled occupancy and abundance, taking into account detection, and we used the unmarked package in R. For the broad-toothed rat data, our abundance data for this species was the proportion of the 50 survey points where we detected them, and we modelled this using a generalised linear model with over-dispersed beta binomial distribution. At our low elevation sites, there were no horses, and there were only 12 sites with deer damage, so we could only look at the effects of herbivores for the Alps subset of the data. I'm going to show you results from models that were within 2 AOCC of the best models, and which were also significant at the 0.05 level. And of course, staying below 0.05 means that we won't be seeing any results from the alpine beer skink. Now, our first results are for responses to fire. So here we can see that the southern water skink actually increased in abundance with the number of fires between 1939 and 2019. So here's a species that might benefit from a fire every decade or so. The alpine water skink had an interesting interaction between moss and number of fires. So when moss cover is low or absent, we see that there's basically no skinks across the whole range of fire frequency. Whereas if you have high moss cover, you can get quite high numbers if the number of fires in the past 80 years is low. As the number of fires increases, the number of skinks decline. The alpine bog skink had this response to fire. That is, no response. But the broad-toothed rat is quite affected by fire, both in its occurrence. You can see declines as fire severity increases. The occurrence of this species declines towards zero, but also its abundance declines in the same sort of way. What about how species responded to deer and horses? The only response to deer and horses was this one by the broad-toothed rat, and you can see that it's significant, but also there's a fair bit of uncertainty in here, but you can see a declining response, consistent with other research on this species. Now, we didn't find any other effects of deer and horses, and there was no interactions with fire. Now, that's surprising, given the damage that feral herbivores do to bogs and streams, and the potential for higher impacts after fire. Now, possibly reptiles take some time to decline. So, for example, damage that we observed this year might not be reflected in the reptile numbers until next year. Now, overall, it's a tentative good news that reptiles appear to have some resistance to herbivore impacts, but we can't say anything about the time frame over which this resistance might be maintained. There were some interesting results for the other environmental variables. For example, the alpine water skink declined with increasing weed cover, and we saw a similar pattern for the alpine bog skink, where its abundance declined as weed cover increased. Now, the literature suggests that this kind of pattern could happen through altered food availability with weed invasion, reduced thermoregulation opportunities, increased predation risks, or they just might avoid these suboptimal habitats. Some other important results were that the southern water skink increased with elevation, more southern water skinks at high elevation. The southern water skink also increased with the number of logs. So this is a species that likes habitat with lots of logs. In contrast, the alpine water skink declined with the number of logs. Now it's interesting to put the two water skink species results together. Just give them a little bit here. The southern water skink does well at high elevation with more frequent fire and more logs. The alpine water skink does poorly with high fire frequency and possibly is worse off with more logs. Now, how would we get an environment with more logs? Well, Zach thought that trees killed in the 2003 fires were now falling over and creating habitat for the southern water skink. So increases in fire frequency could favour replacement of the alpine water skink by the southern water skink, meaning not only a loss of biodiversity, but ultimately less upper body strength and flexibility for herpetologists who will need to mention the alpine water skink less often than the southern water skink. Now, there are some priority knowledge gaps to fill coming out of this research, in particular this potential for declines of alpine water skink and increases in southern water skink is an important area for future research. But also for the skinks, we really need longer term studies that measure impacts of herbivores and fire over a few years, and we should be able to evaluate things like survival and reproductive success. I think this will give us a more powerful insight into the impacts of herbivores and fires. For the broad-toothed rat, the priority next steps that I could see are to find out how quickly habitat recovers with and without horses and deer, and then find out how long it takes for the broad-toothed rats to recolonise those areas. Now this would tell us something about how important it is to control feral herbivores after fire, and whether assisted colonisation might be needed to fill habitat after it recovers. The message for managers is to keep getting rid of feral herbivores. Now this snapshot study shows that that's going to help the broad-toothed rat, and other research shows that there's a whole range of other benefits of removing feral herbivores, particularly horses, from the high country. Also, we've seen that weed management is going to be important for some of the skinks, something that wasn't really on the radar before. Now that could include reducing weed risks from feral herbivores, which the literature tells us could pose a substantial risk. And this will be difficult, but managers need to do what they can to break up those megafires in a way that protects alpine wetlands. This will have benefits for the broad-toothed rat as well as the alpine water skink. I'd just like to finish by acknowledging the indigenous lands on which we did this work, including the Kurnai, Jaitmatang, Bidwell and Ngarigo lands, and I'm coming to you from Wiradjuri land. I'd also like to acknowledge our photographers, but particularly the work of Zach Walker, who led all the field work and took many of the photos that I've used today. The project was funded by WWF and the Australian Government's Wildlife and Habitat Bushfire Recovery Program.